America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jordan Bruno, vice president of Job Creators Network.
Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. Today, we are thrilled to be rejoined by EJ Antoni. EJ is a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Grover M. Herman Center for the Federal Budget. His research focuses on federal and monetary policy, and he joins us today to break down how bad a Harris-Walz administration could be for small businesses and the economy overall. EJ, thanks for joining us.
Oh, Elaine, thank you for having me again.
Well, there's no shortage of things to talk about, so hopefully you've got a couple hours with us. But one of the top things that everybody talks about, obviously, is inflation. And while we've seen it moderate, I saw a bunch of tweets by the Biden-Harris administration this weekend claiming that inflation is now under 3% and kind of claiming victory there. And I kind of thought to myself, gosh, that's kind of like the arsonist firefighter, don't you think? I mean, raise inflation to the highest levels and then claim, kind of victory when that your policies are solving it. You're basically having to do things to solve it yourself. So kind of walk our audience through the inflation and what led us to sort of the heights and what's keeping it elevated.
Oh, certainly. I mean, in a word, spending, right? Specifically, government spending is what has caused all of this runaway inflation. There's a reason why we did not have such horrific inflation for 40 years. It's because we never had these blowout budgets and this runaway government spending like we do today. And this, by the way, is part of the reason why the whole narrative around price gouging causing inflation or supply chains causing inflation, it just doesn't even make any sense. Did corporations magically become greedy for the first time in 40 years, or at least more so than they did for the last 40 years? And supply chains, if that is really such a contributor to inflation, then now that supply chains are just as good as they were before the pandemic, there's two different indexes we have that show that, by the way, why haven't costs come down? Not only should inflation have come down, the rate of increase, but the actual costs themselves should have come down, and they haven't. Going back to businesses can't cause inflation because what's essentially happening is the costs that they face are simply being passed on to consumers. Again, we have data from the Biden-Harris administration that shows this, where the price indexes faced by producers or businesses have risen exactly the same amount as the price indexes faced by consumers. So on a percentage basis, it's identical. And again, the reason for that is because it's not the businesses that are causing inflation. It's not the consumer that's causing inflation. It's government spending, because when the government spends, in this case, trillions of dollars they don't have, they go to the Federal Reserve to get them to print the money in order to finance those trillions of dollars in runaway government spending. And the result of that is a devaluation of the dollar. We've seen our currency lose about a fifth of its value in less than 4 years. That's pretty terrible. It's not the worst thing we've ever seen in this country, but it's up there. It's pretty darn terrible. And as we have seen that spending come down, where we don't have quite as many of the ridiculously sized spending bills as we did for the first couple of years of this administration, the result has been less inflation. Having a divided Congress has been a huge help here. because it's just too difficult for either side to get across the finish line a lot of the spending that they would both like. And we should point out, this is not strictly a Democrat problem here, where we have had a lot of Republicans who have gone along with these runaway spending bills. We have a lot of Republicans who have their own pet projects that they want to fund. So just because one side might be worse than the other does not mean the other side are a bunch of saints. One thing I think is really important, Elaine, to point out, though, is the fact that there was an economist from the University of Chicago who recently did an analysis on all of the spending we've seen under the Biden-Harris administration. And what he found was basically about half of the inflation is due to the spending that got across the finish line because Kamala Harris was the tie-breaking vote in the Senate on those different pieces of legislation. So by no means can we say this is a Biden problem. This is a Biden-Harris problem. And going back to your analogy to conclude here about the arsonist playing firefighter, at this point, everything has burned down that was previously on fire. The house is gone, except now we have a firefighter, so-called firefighter, who says, I'm going to fix inflation, and their solution is to throw gasoline on it. They're going to try to douse the flames, put them out with gasoline instead of water here. What I mean by that is she wants to spend trillions more, and so does Waltz, by the way. In other words, they want to do all of the things that got us into this mess in the first place as a way to fix the problem.
Speaking of gasoline, we've sort of looked at it as the reckless government spending and all of those bills that have led to the inflation, but also the anti-energy policies. I mean, it's just sort of common sense to think, even if you don't have any kind of economic background, if the price of gas goes up, which means it's going to cost more to truck things in to get it ultimately to the shelf, that it would cause inflation as well. And we've seen such anti-energy policies coming out of the Biden administration. I mean, from day one, they canceled the Keystone Pipeline and has really hamstrung the entire energy industry since then.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. And this is a very, very good example, Elaine, of how you don't have to simply devalue the dollar in order to cause prices to rise. It might not be strictly inflation from an academic standpoint, where we say inflation is a monetary phenomenon as opposed to just anything that increases costs. However, you still have to take as true the fact that all of these cost increases, no matter where they come from, are getting passed on to consumers. Fuel, which you brought up, is such a great point, because it is used not only as a fuel in terms of providing heat, let's say, where you'll have home heating oil, which is essentially the exact same thing as diesel fuel. But on top of that, you are also increasing the cost to transport anything and everything. And the other thing is that even services, which you may say, all right, when I go to the grocery store, I get it. I grab a carton of milk off the shelf. That carton of milk got there on a truck. But what about services? How do fuel costs increase the cost of services? That doesn't really make any sense. When I go to a tax accountant, let's say, the tax accountant isn't having to transport anything. He's sitting behind his computer. That's true, except that tax accountant is paying for goods throughout the economy. In other words, he or she is facing higher costs, and he or she will pass on those higher costs, that higher cost of living, to his or her customers. And so it really does a number anywhere and everywhere throughout the economy when we get these higher fuel costs.
EJ, can you describe, Kamala's finally coming out with her economic platform. How would you describe it as an economist, and what would its impact be on ordinary Americans?
Oh, great question, Jordan. Unfortunately, it's more of the same. Again, if you're going to do more of the same, expect more of the same. The problem here is that I think it would actually be even worse. In other words, it's a doubling down in terms of the public policies. So it's even more spending, taxing, and regulating. I mean, this whole idea of taxing unrealized gains is absolutely nuts. There's just no other word for it. I mean, no other word that's polite, at least. It is such impossible. It is so impossible to square that circle, I guess you would have to say, because how on earth do you possibly evaluate these equities or these assets that are constantly fluctuating in value? I mean, not just day by day, but second by second. you can sit in front of your computer all day and watch the ticker for the Dow Jones, for example. I mean, you're really going to tell me that you're just going to pick some arbitrary date and time, a point in time here, and you're going to say, okay, this is when we are evaluating all of your assets. It just makes absolutely no sense. And there's no plan in that for what happens if you take a loss. Do you get a tax credit? Do you get a tax refund? How are we going to work that into the system? I mean, these people have not thought through their proposals. They're simply trying to get any amount of money from anyone, anywhere they can throughout this economy. And but let's put the tax aside for a second. Just look at the regulatory front. I mean, again, the regulations from this administration have cost literally tens of thousands of dollars per family in this country. You are paying that much more in regulatory costs than you were just 4 years ago. And now Harris and Waltz want to do even more. They want to not just keep pace with, or I should say, keep that regulatory pace, but they want to accelerate it. So they want even more of this Green New Deal nonsense, for example. And one of the reasons why regulation is so devastating to the economy as opposed to taxing and spending, which is problematic already. But if the government taxes you, they take $1 from you, and then they give it to somebody else, and that person goes out and spends it, yes, there are inefficiencies in that, but the money is still going back into the economy. With regulation, that doesn't happen. The economic activity literally just goes away because it's no longer profitable for anybody to do it. And right. So it is truly a deadweight loss on the economy.
The legacy media is trying to position Harris as a middle-class tax cutter. I'm just reading it on every single old mainstream media publication this weekend. How are they getting away? How is she getting away with framing herself as a middle-class tax cutter? And what would her tax policies actually be to the middle class?
Well, I suppose she's getting away with it because she has so many sycophants in the media who are willing to just carry water for her. I mean, look, Jordan, you can look at her record in the Senate, for example. She never met a tax increase she didn't like. Let's put it that way. And now what is she advocating for? Ending the Trump tax reform. That would cause middle-class taxes to go up, not down. On top of that, the only group who would actually get a windfall from seeing the Trump tax reform expire would essentially be the Democrat donor class. It would be high-income individuals in high-tax states. Well, guess what? That means almost entirely blue states, and those high-income individuals are also the group from which the Democrats get most of their money. Now, there's nothing wrong with rich people donating money to politics. Let's be clear. That happens on both sides of the aisle. We have freedom of speech, and you should be able to donate whatever you want to candidates. I'm not opposed to that at all. I'm simply pointing out the hypocrisy here of these folks because the numbers don't line up with their narrative. Essentially, they say that they want higher taxes on the wealthy. Their policies would do the opposite. They say they want lower taxes on the middle class. Again, their policies would do the opposite.
Let me just ask one more question on the point you just made about the wealthy donors in blue states and that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, if it expires, would really benefit them. Can you dig a little deeper on that one? Is that mostly to do with the SALT?
Absolutely, Elaine. That's the primary driver here. So one of the things that happened in the Trump tax reform, and this is part of the reason why I like calling it a tax reform, not simply a tax cut, because it really wasn't a strict tax cut by many definitions. So what they did was they capped the deduction for state and local taxes, or SALT, as you said. And what that meant was that you can't simply transfer the tax burden of high income individuals in these high tax states onto the general taxpayer. You are essentially telling people, look, you're living in an area with high taxes, you're making a lot of money, you have to pay those taxes. You don't get to essentially use this as a loophole in order to increase the federal tax burden for your fellow Americans, particularly those in low tax states. And so by capping that at $10,000, you have people in New York City who previously would have owed literally millions of dollars to state and local governments who now pay much less than that. And again, if you get rid of this tax reform, the result of that is going to be a windfall to those individuals. And it's not 100,000 or 200,000. It's literally millions of dollars per person.
I want to switch gears with you on jobs. Every month, the Biden administration takes a big victory lap on jobs. And then there's a revision the next month down on the previous month. It gets no headlines. And they continue with this sort of exaggerated narrative that the labor market is extremely strong.
Mm-hmm.
Massive revision just a few weeks ago. I believe it was through the 12 months from April of 2023 through March of 2023 through April of 2024. Over 800,000 jobs. Tell us what that means in real terms.
Well, essentially, when you add up both of the types of revisions you were just talking about, the annual benchmark that covers that 12-month period, but then also the revisions for each individual month where you get an initial number and then the next 2 months you get revisions, all of those downward revisions combined, you lost about 1.2 million jobs over that 12-month period. In other words, you just wiped out about a third of all the job gains that we thought we had during that 1 year span. Again, you can't tell us that this is a robust economy. You can't tell us that this is somehow a strong labor market when all of the numbers are essentially just garbage. And I don't want to. How do I put this, Elaine? I don't want to say that there's anything nefarious going on at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, simply because I have no evidence of that. To be clear, I actually even know a few folks at BLS, and they've given me no indication that there is anything nefarious going on. However, just because you didn't make a sin of commission doesn't mean you haven't committed a sin of omission. And I think that's what's going on here. What I mean by that is there are serious problems in the models and the methodologies at BLS, serious ones. And that has been evident since the spring of 2022. So this is not a new phenomenon. This didn't simply pop up out of nowhere. And I think the scandal here is the fact that despite a lot of evidence for those problems, nothing has been done at BLS to solve any of them. And to be clear, I'm not at BLS. So as a third-party observer, I have enough information at my fingertips to see that there's clearly something wrong. The folks inside should have even more information, and it should be even more evident to them that there are problems, again, with their models, with their methodologies. The assumptions that you made in 2019, for example, about certain aspects of the economy in order to build these models, they don't hold true anymore in this post-pandemic world of ours. And again, the fact that nothing has been done to address these problems that first started popping up over 2 years ago, that's a scandal. And the BLS needs to answer to Congress, and they should give Congress an explanation and, frankly, give the American people an explanation. Think of all the decision makers who use this data and who need it to be accurate and delivered in a timely manner. I mean, it's everyone from the individual investor to the Federal Reserve trying to set interest rates.
Well, explain it. There's the two surveys, and you've got the establishment survey and the household survey. What's the difference between the two of them? And what, are they just picking the survey they like best each month?
So essentially, you have one survey that just asks questions of businesses, and then another one that asks questions of households. And the divergence between those two, they usually move, not quite in lockstep, but they trend very tightly together. The divergence between the two that we have today is truly unprecedented, where when we ask households, how many people in your household are actually employed, that number hasn't been going up. It's actually been going down lately. And so you have this huge gap of literally millions where we poll businesses and we keep asking them, how many people do you have on payroll? And that number keeps going up. There's a few different reasons for why. One of which is the fact that if I go out and I get a second job or even a third job because, my cost of living is up so much, I'm having trouble making ends meet, et cetera. Every time I go out and I get another job, it gets counted as another payroll. And so when you have this explosion in multiple job holders, it's causing those numbers to rise. Now, there's a few other statistical problems that are kind of a bit in the weeds, but suffice to say that the divergence between these two has never happened to this extent before. It is clearly evidence of a problem. And again, the fact that nothing has been done to address it or to figure out which of these two surveys should we really be paying attention to, that's a scandal. Now, which is the number that we actually get each month? That would be the establishment survey. So when they say 100,000 jobs were added, that's how much the number of payrolls increased in the economy over the last month. Conversely, when we hear, Elaine, about an unemployment rate of 4.0 or 4.3, 4.8%, whatever the case may be, that comes from the household survey, where we ask people, all right, how many people in this household are in the labor force? How many people in this household are unemployed, or employed or unemployed, et cetera?
Yeah.
EJ, so Kamala's kept a lid on a lot of her economic policies, seems like for a couple of reasons. One, to just ride this wave of media-generated enthusiasm, and another maybe to hide her far-left past and her real socialist leanings. There are some reports that she's going to come out with some more economic policies. What do you expect to see from her over the next few weeks, policy-wise?
I would expect to see a lot of promises, probably none of which will actually be followed through on. I mean, this is very typical of politicians, I think, in general. But one of the really interesting things right now, Jordan, in this particular moment in modern American political history, is the fact that you are facing two candidates who have both essentially, done the job, or at least both held executive office. And so the American people don't actually really need to listen to what this person is promising or what that person is promising. You can just simply ask, what have they each done during their time in office? That's part of the reason why, frankly, this whole narrative doesn't make a lot of sense that we keep hearing from the Harris Waltz camp, which is, on day one, we will do X, Y, and Z to solve all of our current problems. Day one was 3.5 years ago. What have you been doing in the meantime, right? And so, again, you can ask yourself, under which administration, Trump or Biden-Harris, did my standard of living go up? Under which did it go down? Under which administration did credit card debt explode? And under which administration was I actually able to pay down some of my debt? Under which administration was housing affordable? And under which administration is it the most unaffordable it has been ever by some metrics?
And what recommendations would you have for conservatives trying to contend against the big government Santa Claus policies of the left? I mean, when we're up against free like bailing out medical bills, bailing out student debt, increasing welfare, increasing child tax credit to $6,000, all these far leftist big government policies, we don't want to sound like Scrooge, but how do we make an articulate case against these big government policies to get people to our side?
That's a great question. I don't think you can win against Santa Claus, quite frankly. There's a reason why he is still the mascot for Christmas to this day, right? You can't win against Santa Claus. And so I think what you need to do is convince people that the other side are not actually Santa Claus. They are not giving you anything. They are taking from you with one hand to give to you with the other. Of course, while their hands are behind their back, they take off a little bit off the top for themselves and their cronies on K Street here in Washington. So I think we need to help people understand, look, when the federal government promises to give you something, they're making that promise to everybody else too. And so is everyone paying for your free stuff? Yeah, that's true. But you're paying for everybody else's too. And this is why every time we have a new government program and we have more government spending, why it doesn't eliminate poverty. It doesn't cause everybody's standard of living to go up. If these crazy ideas like, well, let's just give everybody free cash, if that actually worked, then every third world country in the world would just simply do that because it's an easy way out of poverty. But that's not how the world works.
EJ, the Fed has been very aggressive at trying to bring down inflation, the rate of inflation. And now that we have hit under 3% on inflation, and in addition to that huge revision that we just talked about on the jobs of over 800,000 jobs, which frankly, he seemed a little surprised on that one at the meeting, at the press conference. And did indicate that that the labor market may be weaker than thought. What are your thoughts on a rate cut coming before the election?
Well, I think, unfortunately, this Federal Reserve has proven themselves to be very, very political. They are not politically independent. They are not data dependent. It's sad, but it's the reality of the situation, and we should acknowledge it as such, and then move on from there. Unfortunately, we are so close to the election. I think it's pretty clear that any rate cut is going to have the impact of causing things like equity markets to reinflate. Yes, it is a bubble, and yes, it has been deflating, inflating as the Fed has made different moves this year. But it would be a last shot in the arm, I would think, right before the election, which is not a good look for the Fed. The other thing is that if you cut rates in September, it's not going to be long enough to have any kind of real impact before the election in terms of the average consumer's credit card rates or the average consumer's mortgage rates. For businesses, the loans that businesses are trying to get as well, whether it's to build a new factory or whether it's just something like they need credit for their monthly inventory purchases. The other thing that I think was really, really important to remember, Elaine, is the fact that the Fed can't actually do anything for the labor market, certainly not in the long term. We have this Keynesian notion that the Fed can reduce rates, and that's going to cause some inflation, but it helps people get jobs. You may have a temporary short-term effect where you do have a positive effect on economic activity, and that can mean more hiring. But at the end of the day, the Fed printing money, the Fed devaluing the dollar is not what's going to create jobs. Again, certainly not in the long term, but I guarantee you it is definitely going to give us inflation.
The mortgage rates have been really high, obviously, as a result of interest rates going up. It hasn't really dampened the cost of housing, which is usually you see that difference. So housing really hasn't come down a lot. If we see the mortgage, two questions. If we see the mortgage rates come down and or we see a Kamala Harris give away $25,000 in down payments, what do you think is going to happen in real terms here?
Well, when we see things, Elaine, like these demand side subsidies, like you just mentioned, where we're just going to give a potential home buyer tens of thousands of dollars, the seller smells blood in the water when you do that, and they will then sell the house for more money. So far from making homes more affordable, you make them less affordable. Look, we've been down this road literally for decades with student loans. And in fact, the Federal Reserve has actually done some very interesting analysis on this, where they found that, yes, every time you increase not just student loans, but grants, whether it's a direct payment or financing option, doesn't matter. The more money you put at the fingertips of these young kids trying to go to college, the more colleges will increase tuition and fees. Mm-hmm. It's that simple. It's not rocket science. And unfortunately, if we keep doing that with housing, we already have plenty of demand side subsidies. If we add to them, if we keep doing this, you're going to continue to increase costs. Now, in terms of what kind of effect will rate cuts have, unless we're going to get a couple hundred basis points of cuts, it's probably not even going to put a dent in the housing market. Part of the reason right now is that we have seen a recoupling between interest rates and home prices. In other words, as interest rates come down, people now can borrow more and keep their monthly mortgage payment the same. That has historically been the case. That's why home prices and interest rates tend to move in opposite directions and have literally for decades. It's been a very tight relationship, very tight inverse relationship. The problem today is the fact that we have had so much inflation that the cost to home builders to actually create these homes and bring them to market is at a record high. It has never been higher. And so the home builders can't afford to reduce their prices, the prices at which they are actually selling these homes, because they'll lose money. So that's the new home side. What about the existing home or used home side? Mm-hmm. The problem there is that you have all of these people who in 2020 and even into 2021 were able to get mortgages at 2 or 3%, or at least refinance an existing mortgage at 2 to 3%. Those folks now have golden handcuffs. If they sell their home, they will lose that mortgage. And the result of that is they now need to get a mortgage at 7 or 8%, sometimes more in certain markets. That means you can afford much less house. And so you have to sell your home at this huge premium so that you have this massive down payment to put towards the next home. And that means you can borrow much less and the higher interest rate doesn't bite as hard. In other words, you can keep your monthly mortgage payment, very manageable. This is all happening, by the way, with the backdrop of this runaway inflation that has caused the cost of living besides housing to simply explode. And so a family, for example, having to pay 50% of their take-home pay towards a monthly mortgage payment, that would be bad enough in regular times. But today, it's happening at a time when families don't have 50% of their budget left. They don't have anything left at the end of the month. By the time you get through food, transportation costs, insurance, rent, etc., there's nothing left, and they're going into debt, which is why credit card debt is now at a record high today. It's why things like auto loans, the defaults and delinquencies on that type of debt are skyrocketing today at the fastest pace of increase since the Great Recession. So it's not as if we can simply cut rates here and it's magically going to cause the housing market to unfreeze, to thaw. I wish it were the case, but it's not.
Very interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard that analysis. That's really thought-provoking. EJ, where can our listeners go to learn more about your work?
Best place to find me is on Twitter or X, whatever we call it these days. But the handle there is @real_EJ Antoni. Excellent. Well, EJ, thanks so much for taking the time to join us again on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. Thank you all for taking the time to tune in and listen. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. And we'll be back soon.